has. Yeah, great.
Good. Okay. So I've kind of doing this talk has kind of, I suppose, has kind of got me to sort of speed up really with what I've been interested in for a while, and kind of looking and investigating what role craft plays in contemporary art practice. So the talk's called Making Good. So Making Good, I used to do painting and decorating, so it's a term that's used for sort of in decorating and building to describe the finishing touches to a project. So I thought it was kind of interesting to sort of start with that phrase. And I guess I'm interested in what we mean by something being kind of well made, something being finished, and specifically what we mean by craftspersonship. And I'm going to use that term because I think craftsmanship is very a sort of very gendered term, and I think it's good to sort of try and sort of question that really. But also, so I want to question what we mean by the description of something being good or well made. Are we talking about the finish, or are we talking about the control of the process? And I guess in the talk, I'm not specifically focusing on work that makes a reference to craft. There is some of that in the talk, but more about just how kind of craft sits into or beds down in contemporary art practice, and specifically really sculpture. And so it's really, this is this has kind of come about really partly from I teach at the Art Academy, and one of the elements that we talk about is about craftspersonship and what we mean by that. And in a recent sort of discussion with a group of students, one of the students who I noticed, Derry, who's sort of joined us this evening, mentioned, we were talking about what craftspersonship means, and he described it as being not an accident. So I was kind of interested in what that means as well. And I guess this talk is actually something of an experiment for me, because it's about me sort of investigating this area. And I'm going to do that by talking a little bit about my practice, but also about the practice of other artists and how I feel they are using craft in their work, or craftspersonship in their work. And then we've got time for, I think it's a sort of 40-minute talk, of 30-40 minutes, and then we've got questions at the end. So I'm afraid I'm not going to be really able to offer you a conclusion to this lecture, and I probably can't offer you a sort of specific argument, but I'm just going to sort of talk about my interest in it, and just as a sort of starting point, if you like. As a sculptor, I've built up a number of skills in terms of making. And those skills enable me to make my work. And there's a number of reasons for why I do that. One is there's a kind of economic thing. So it's actually having these skills enables me to make my work, and to make work to a kind of a level where if I was having someone to make it for me, I would struggle with the budget. At the same time, also I enjoy it. I enjoy making. I enjoy the kind of the process, and sometimes what I do is very kind of monotonous actually. I kind of see things through from if I'm polishing something, it's taking it through a number of different stages. But then also at the same time, there's a very kind of gestural, elemental side to my practice as well. And I guess overall there's this kind of discovery of ideas through making and through doing. So first, I also wanted to mention there's a couple of so students of mine who have kind of tuned in I've mentioned these books before, but these texts are kind of really, I think, really interesting. So there's Richard Sennett, The Craftsman, which I suppose is a kind of attempt, it was written about 10 years ago, attempt to de-romanticize what we mean by craftsmen. And so in a lot of, there's a lot of discussion in the book about open source software, the Linux system, and everything from that to kind of the NHS service, and how people who work for the NHS could be described as craftspeople. So it's quite an interesting take on the idea of craft. The other book was this one, which is one of the Documents of Contemporary Art series, which are published by the Whitechapel. And they've done about 20 of these books with different titles, including Nature and so on. And this one, Craft, is just full of lots of juicy kind of essays and interviews craft in relation to fine art practice. So it's a really good thing to kind of dip into. So there's some quotes from there as well. Okay, right. So the first image is of a piece of work I made in 2008 called Crystal, which is made from hand-blown and kiln-formed glass. I didn't have any involvement in the process of making it, so I had no. It's interesting. I had an interest in glass blowing, but really felt that it was going to be such a long process to get there that I should work with a craftsperson to help me make this piece or to realise this piece. So I made a model, and then they blew the piece, blew the glass, and then we put it in a kiln and allowed it to slump over a surface. So it's the idea of a sort of a crafted object that's kind of gone wrong. It's sort of like it's dripping and sort of glooping over the corner of a surface. This is another work made in 2010. This is called Indeterminate System and was made specifically for a show at Leighton House Museum, which is, if any of you know it, it's a very decorative interior, an exterior building designed and made by Frederick Lord Leighton, a very successful Victorian artist. And it's got this very kind of exuberant interior with lots of appropriation and kind of borrowing of materials and theft of materials and from different countries. This piece is made using a process called Japanning. So the line of the piece is a very kind of almost like a scribble, and then the surface is very exacting. So it's a kind of contrast between the form and the surface being very seductive, made using a process called Japanning, which was invented in the sort of 17th and 18th centuries to emulate Oriental lacquer work. So it was, but it was specifically something that was done in Europe to meet the demand. So there was so much demand for Oriental lacquer work at that time that the Europeans started to make their own to kind of meet the demand. So it's about that kind of idea of cultural appropriation, but through this kind of the sort of material finishes, really. And it's actually layers of varnish built up over, so there's a wooden structure with layers of varnish built up over the surface, which have a tiny amount of red pigment in. So it's got about 12 layers, and then it's sanded and polished back, so it has this kind of luster to it, if you like. This is one of my favourite objects. This is at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's a piece of, several pieces of Delft pottery, which are kind of were rejects, if you like, that failed in the firing, and kind of have, all these plates have kind of melted together. All the glaze they've sort of fallen over and amalgamated and glued together to form this kind of lump. And I kind of love the idea of this a wrongness and something that's kind of gone wrong and kind of is almost like there's a potential that it's collapsing and it's moving as well. This is a work from 2006, which I made called Bog Standard. The phrase bog standard comes from it was a glaze that was invented by Ideal Standard for sanitary ware, so a glaze for glazing bogs, so hence the phrase bog standard. I was kind of interested, I'm quite often interested in these colloquial terms, but again it's a sort of idea of appropriating a way of doing something. And this is the kind of the end of that series of pieces. This is called Ripple, and the idea of almost a sort of a giant offcut of a ribbon of clay from the factory. It's about 2.5 meters tall. Okay, and this work is a piece called Origin, which was made for the University of Oxford, and it was fabricated from steel and stainless steel, and the majority of the work is made by a fabricator. So I think that's quite an interesting sort of discussion point, really, is how much of that is, can an object be, or an artwork be crafted and be made by someone else? Does it have to be handmade by the individual? Is that integral to it? I suppose I would argue that I instruct people how to do things. I'm very specific about ways of doing things and a particular finish and a surface treatment, and so I'm kind of involved in the process even though I'm not physically making it. Another shot of it there, and specifically wants to look at this central area of the piece. In the middle you have these elements which are made from stainless steel, so there's pieces of stainless steel that are welded together kind of give the impression of data. So it was a place called the Big Data Institute. In fact, this is the kind of research campus where they're now trying to develop a vaccine for the coronavirus at the moment. So that's the part of Oxford University where that's going on, where they use data to combined with some kind of clinical testing to identify cures for illnesses. So it's a very specific way of working that avoids a lot of wasted time, really. So it was, in a way, this piece is about a kind of celebration of that kind of the work that goes on there, basically. But towards the centre of the piece, there are some bent sections. So the majority of them are straight. It's meant to be almost look like pixels that are kind of at the centre of the piece. But in the middle, the central elements are bent. So it's kind of like a return to something handmade, something organic. And so I'm kind of interested in that idea of what is handmade, and what do we mean by something that's gone wrong, something that's intended. So those kind of discussions. And this is a SketchUp drawing that I developed to present the idea for this work to the university. So when I proposed it, I showed them this drawing. It's basically a 3D drawing made on SketchUp with a computer but the overall term for this would be computer-aided design. And so, interestingly, I think if you look at the Sennett book, even though he's kind of trying to de-romanticize our notions of craft, in fact, he kind of, there's a part in it where he sort of talks about computer-aided design being somehow less worthy than drawing by hand. So this idea, or the notion that if you somehow have a better understanding of an object that you're intending to make, or a work that you're intending to make, by being able to draw it by hand, and somehow the fact that you can change it so many times, and you can change what you're drawing repeatedly with a computer, somehow slightly kind of devalues the process. And I would argue the opposite. I think actually it's very empowering, and it enables you to, as an artist, to kind of refine and hone and craft what you're making, and really kind of reduce it down to exactly what you want to make. And it's about this intention and being able to kind of create your intention visually. So I think there's that side to it, which is really important. And also at the same time, being able to sort of work with 3D drawing on a computer has enabled me to have a better understanding of 3 dimensions, and in fact has kind of improved, I think, my hand drawing. So I think there's definitely a craft element to this, and I think people would probably suggest that there's sometimes a suggestion or an intonation that this somehow happens, this kind of work happens by the pressing return and something just magically appears. But actually, it's a long process. It's a long process of getting involved with this model and trying to sort of make it work and trying to draw it and make it convincing as well. So there's a whole level of complexity to it that I think is just as creative as anything else. So here's a shot this is a shot in my studio, which is showing these central elements for the piece Origin. So they're made of clay. So I kind of emulated a piece of box section steel or a bar of steel, and then exactly the same size, and then bent the clay. So this idea of deliberately bending it and making it natural and making it actually physically having that bend in it. So it's not a version of it, it's not a prop, it's the real thing, if you like. And then these objects were then scanned. So you can see the computer in the foreground, and there's a OBJ file of the element, which has then been scanned in, so that I could then return this object into a small scale and place it into the model. So I was wearing those glasses for a reason. I did need them to actually see this tiny detail, but you can see that there's a small element in the center which has all the details of the folds of the clay in there, but it's just been somehow reduced down through the scanning process. So it's scanned and then made into that's a 3D print. Okay. Also 3D printing, there's a sort of notion of collaboration as well, and kind of I think it's quite interesting going back to Senate, this idea of open source as well. So this is some visors. So for the Art Academy, I was been printing visor frames for PPE, and this is a kind of mass of them there. And there's all these files being shared online that you can, so people can anywhere can kind of use the information and print these visor frames or anything they want. And so that's interesting, but also at the same time, there was a lot of this had to be finished by hand. So these pieces, you'd end up with a stack of them, and you'd have to cut them and then sand them all down by hand anyway, because they're kind of rough. So it's a sort of, I think there's never really a, mass production doesn't, or using these kind of mechanical processes doesn't always take out the element of working by hand. So that was just a sort of short film of, so it's a bit noisy, a CNC cutter. So essentially, is a I used this on a residency that I did at Winchester College, and it's basically is there any noise still, or has it stopped, Susie? Is it what? It's okay, good. Thumbs up. All right, good. I was worried that it was just going to be my kids' racket. So basically, it's like a drill bit that runs almost like a graph. So it's like it's sort of following a series of lines that go over the contours. So it's cutting out of a piece of wood these shapes, and it's a really it's quite an interesting thing that you can make things that you really couldn't. I don't think. Well, I would really struggle to do by hand. So this is the final piece that I made, which was made. So it's from a big old block of pine. And that's a detail of it there, but there's these sort of spheres that I found, and actually I got the spheres off open source SketchUp drawings, so I could just kind of take the spheres off, put them into a structure, and then load that into a machine, and then the machine cut the forms. So it's using that kind of graph contour idea. But I would really struggle to make that by hand, and in a way, I'm just using another tool. I think I'm just using another tool to kind of create that. This is more of a reminder, really, to put this in this work. This is a piece by Ettore Sottsass, and it's the Memphis bookcase from, I think, 1980. But Sottsass, in the craft text that I mentioned earlier, in 1946, so he's a postmodern designer. I didn't realise he lived until he was about 100, actually. But in 1946, he said that so many things made by the craftsman can be made by machine more beautifully, better and cheaper. So it's kind of interesting, and he sees mass production almost as the craftsman. So the craftsman that's been replaced in a way. So he's kind of in celebration of that. So I think you can use, for me, I think the rapid prototyping and CNC machines, they're kind of tools that you can use to make whatever you want to make, and I think it's just understanding what they do and then controlling that process, which does include things like this. So this is I went to for a bit of research, sadly I couldn't find any images of the robot itself, but they have a robot in well, lots of stone places have this, but in Pietrasanta, there are a number of different stone carvers and quarries there, and there's this one company that has a 7-axis CNC robot that will carve things like this. So something very detailed like this can be carved using machines. So that what we're looking at there has not been touched by a human hand. It might be at the end that they might finish it and make it good by just sort of sanding it at the surface, but I think it's probably only a matter of time until they create a tool that will then do all the sanding and the finishing as well. So it's really fascinating what you can do, and I'm sort of trying to develop ideas for carving in stone, because I don't know how to carve stone, and I have carved stone before, but sometimes I think that's a question about where do you decide what you're gonna learn how to do, and what do you decide that you're not going to learn how to do. So talking about work in general, about other artists' work. This piece is by an artist called Jonathan Prince, and so I would say that this is stereotypically what we would think of as a well-crafted object. I mean, it's got it's the curve of the structure is perfectly formed. the surface is beautifully polished. There's not a flaw to it. And actually, I think when you can go on Jonathan Prince's Instagram page, and it's I'm interested in the process. I'm interested in how he makes the work, less in the final work itself, because it's got this, he has this incredible process, which he's very open and honest about, that he'll show you how everything's made, and it's really quite seductive watching this process and watching the making process. Each one of these pieces of stainless steel is bent and curved and then fitted and welded into place and then polished back within an inch of its life. So this, I would say, is what the stereotype of a crafted object, or a crafted sculpture, well-crafted sculpture. So I'm gonna kind of look at a few other examples of pieces that I think we could describe as being crafted. So another work. This is made Robert Morris. These cubes are made from mirror. They are, there's no evidence that they've been made by hand at all. But a lot of these, the elements within the minimalist sculptures, Judd and Carl Andre, are made by hand, because that's the only way to get this exacting finish, where you can make something that's so sort of perfect to the millimeter in terms of the geometry, that it demands to be made by hand. And actually, Carl Andre described himself as, he said, "I am an artisan. That is a worker who employs himself essentially at his own tool to produce goods that he exchanges for other people's goods." So it's quite interesting, that term artisan, I think, as well. Like, where does that fit in with a kind of fine art practice? So conversely, there's this work, which is a piece by Gavin Turk, which is called Robert Morris Untitled 1965 to 1972, or whatever the dates are. And so Gavin Turk, when I was at college, came and gave a talk. And this was the piece that he made for his interim show at the Royal College of Art. And it's exactly the same scale and same materials as the Robert Morris work, but he described it as if it was made in England. So at the time, so it's this idea that it's a sort of really, it's like a failed minimalist sculpture. It's kind of, there's a lot of humor in it. But interestingly, he made this work, and then he spent such a long time trying to corrode the mirror. And he spent this, so there was a huge kind of crafting process in trying to kind of create the feeling that something's gone wrong, and this kind of sense of wrongness, which is something I'm really interested in. I don't know if any of you got to see this show. This was Grayson Perry, which was the title. What was the title of the show? I've just forgotten it. I can't remember it. It was at the British Museum. It's good. The Tomb of the Unknown Craftsman. So it was at the British Museum, and Grayson Perry used artifacts from the museum and exhibited them alongside his work. So he kind of emulated styles and processes and ways of doing that were used in museum exhibits, and then he kind of subverted them in his way, the way that he works. And central to the show was this ship beautifully made from kind of cast iron and elements built together. But he really got into I found it a really interesting show where he really got into the way of making and really understood that and appropriated it. This is another work that I think is a really interesting way of working. This is Brian Griffiths, and this was a piece which he showed at the Saatchi Gallery. I think it was his degree show piece from Goldsmiths, and this is a work that he showed at the Saatchi Gallery in the late 90s. And seeing it at the time, it was a kind of it was a really exciting piece of work, because you kind of knew it was meant to be a control station for a kind of some sort of technical thing, like a kind of spaceship, or could be anything, but made from really rudimentary everyday materials. So this kind of idea of a sort of control of process, where he's taken there's sort of polystyrene plates and bottle tops, roller arms, and then kind of added them into this installation. And even the way that the tape was used was really specific, and I think this is a really for me this is a crafted object, but just done in a different way. Franz West, a detail of his work. I love the evidence of making in this. So there's these sheets of aluminium which are welded together to create this kind of weird, expressive knot form. And the welds are, they're all visible. They're not been ground down. They've not been polished back. I'm sort of slightly, this is one of those works where I'm kind of slightly jealous of it, which means I think that's usually a good thing. And so it's this sort of the making process is really inherent in the finished piece. So there's these panels which have been bent and formed, and then it's all painted and coated with this thick, rich paint over the surface. Let's put this Guston. This is a bit of sort of Philip Guston again. I think this is a kind of these later works I think are really sophisticated, and there's an obvious relationship with the Franz West work in terms of the both in this kind of the sort of stitching around the form, but also in the forms themselves. And I think there's a kind of something about, for me, Guston is just he's like the artist that I'm most inspired by. I just think there's a kind of elemental quality to it, and it's a physicality and also a sort of wrongness to it. So it's this idea of something that's a bit off kilter. And again, so Monika Sosnowska, and this is a standard beam that you would find in a structure in a building, and it's kind of subverted and it's twisted and it's changed, and she's sort of the piece is bent as it meets the corner. So rather than having two separate pieces which are cut and then joined, it's been bent, which is an incredibly complex process to make this. I don't know how it was done. But it suggests a lot to me, and it suggests an idea of for me this it makes me question, like, what does the intention with it, that this piece is distorted, but at the same time it is beautifully crafted, and it has this surface to it, this sort of quite seductive surface to it, but also there's a sort of wrongness to it as well. And then these images, this is another sculptor called Will Nash, a friend of mine, and I thought I'd enter in these because of what I'm interested in with these is the acknowledgement of the process of making. So feels like I think without the corners which have been welded being visible, it would be quite an austere object and quite a minimal object. But because it has the kind of weld marks in there, it gives you a sense of how it's been created and a sense of how it's been made. So even though it's not stereotypically kind of polished and cleaned up, I feel that the intention in it, and that element of intent, for me, makes it feel like a kind of a crafted object as well. So it doesn't have to be kind of completely neat and perfect. Koons is a kind of, Jeff Koons is an interesting one. I went to his show at the Ashmolean Museum. This work wasn't in that show, but there was a quote from him there, which is that I believe craft is a way of communicating to people that you care about them. So he's quite, there's a sort of, I find him, with what he says, sometimes it's quite hard to take the kind of the massive sincerity there. But what I'm interested in this object is that it's taking something that's really rudimentary, something that's like, taking the elemental material that children use to make something three-dimensional with, and then elevating it to this scale. So this is a large-scale piece. It's probably a couple of meters tall and probably made from bronze, but made to look like Play-Doh. So it's kind of taking it up and then we take it down. So and Koons has no involvement in the making process at all, and that's kind of part of the work. So, but he's very much interested in in using craft and working with craftspeople to make his work. And then Phila de Barlow, and I think these are really, for me, these are really kind of crafted objects as well, because I think they have a feeling of being kind of haphazard, I suppose. This idea of these sticks that kind of cross over one another and are fixed together appear to be fixed together quite loosely, but there's such an intent with it. There is a kind of, obviously things happen along the way and things change in her work. As she's making it, she's making decisions, but each decision is is important, and each decision is very considered. So I think it's going back to that kind of original idea of like it not being an accident. It maybe appears accidental, but that's the beauty of it for me with her work. So coming back to we're sort of back on the workbench here. I just thought I'd kind of come back to talk about what I've been doing recently, partly because I had an exhibition that got cancelled, and I thought I'd just show some things that would have been in the show, but hopefully be shown at some point. So this is one of the elements from the centre of that commission for Oxford University, which I've adapted and added into a structure. So it's this idea of it's actually going to be a column of steel that stands upright, that is kind of bent, so it has this feeling of being distorted. And I suppose it's that interest in, for me, it's the surface. I'm kind of constantly kind of working the surface to this sort of mirror finish, but at the same time there's a sort of sense of something going wrong and collapsing, and and some other works in the process. But this would all be ground out, so you can see the welds there, this structure. The middle section is cast, and then the other parts, which are here, they're just purchased lengths of steel. So it's the idea of a kind of standard piece of steel that's somehow been distorted and somehow gone wrong. And I guess through this kind of process of kind of making, through this process of crafting something, that I'm trying to sort of achieve I guess something a word I talk about a lot with my work is to make something convincing, to make it feel real, and I do that, I think, and that I try to achieve that through the way that I make things. That's it. There we go. I'm going to try and stop sharing. How do I do that?
I think I can do it. My end. Let me just.
Yeah.
Gallery view should. Oh no, maybe not.
A round of applause. Don't we give you a round of applause now?
Yeah.
Let me try and get these.
So you should be able to ask away.
There we go. Is that good? We stop sharing?
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of familiar faces there. It's nice to see you all. Thanks for coming. So, anyone got any questions?
Well, I've got. Sorry, go on, Miss Victoria.
I just wondered, I don't know how we're going to ask questions. Do we raise our hand or do we?
Just ask away, or you can type in the chat if you don't want to ask, and I can ask for you. Yeah.
Ros, do you want to go first? Did you have a question?
Yeah, well, it was, it's not really a question. It was more of a kind of a turning something around that you were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
When you were talking about moving from a drawing practice, drawing with your hand, that experience, and then moving through into a CAD-based process. And I was thinking, I completely get that, because I think there's a massive tacit learning when you make or do anything with your hands that informs you in another way that's not intellectual. But at the same time, if you think of it, let's say you haven't done any drawing, haven't done any making, and you only have been using a computer, then your perception, your knowledge, and your feeling and response. I mean, there's a great wisdom about what you can learn and how you can visualize it and walk around and look under and get scale and place objects near it, which is fantastic. But if we were all coming from that place and we said, yes, but you can also pick up something and try and learn how to draw.
Okay.
And, and move it, you'd have that same sense of, oh, how does that work and why would you do it? How awkward, what push this small sort of pencil or line around? Why would, there'd be that sort of blocking at the beginning. But it's an inquiry, isn't it? It's just another way of chasing down something and feeling something and exploring it. So I've never really felt that I know there's this big discussion between these two things because it's like a machine and a person. I think you can chuck that right back to the Luddites as well, where they resisted for similar reasons. And I sense that really it's resistance to change. It's resistance to that leap into the unknown, because, to have all the questions and the ifs and buts at the beginning, it hampers you from the freedom of just go and find it. It's like jumping into the ocean. What does that feel like? Well, get in it. Go there. And that's an uninhibited exploration. And because you're not having to have massive sort of limitations on why you're doing something, you have a free exploration of see what happens, and it's very genuine and open that way. So it's an observation more than a question.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I think you're right. I think there's something about also. I think that comes into making as well, though. So sort of. I think it's tricky. I've been to sort of shows where there've been a group show, outdoor group show, and a lot of the works have been made for artists by the people organising the show. They've got a fabricator to make the work, and the work looks kind of similar. And it's sort of, because there's a particular way of making that everyone has, and so it's sort of like actually they've used that paint there and they've used that paint there. And so I think, I guess as you're saying, it hadn't really occurred to me, but I think it's what's really important is actually if you can get an understanding of how things are done, I think that's what's really important about how, so yeah, I guess you probably would need to sort of come from have done some drawing to then use the, computer aided design, then go back into it. Also, I think with making, so, I think I can work with steel on a big scale, getting other people to do it because I've done some of it.
What you're talking about. Yeah. You've got a sense of it, you're guiding it, you're understanding their language, but you're making it flow, and you're not just sort of saying, oh, make me a box and then walking away, which is a very remote sort of situation. But it's when you do have a sense of how to do something, you don't have to have acquired that expertise, which can take years, as you were saying. You have choice of what you do with your life. You're going to spend an awful long time learning just one aspect, taking it back to the crystal moment at the beginning. But at the same time, it's the control and knowledge. The piece is being made because you're informed. So I don't really see it as competitive. I think that when you know what you're talking about, it shows in the work. And that's the key thing. And I always use the word resolved then, even if you're not doing it yourself. A piece it feels resolved when you walk around it, when you sort of are with it, and you get a sense that it is completely resolved, that the artist has seen it all around and felt it. And you think, right, I know that this is right. And you can walk up to other pieces and you think, oh, okay, they haven't seen that yet. And you think, okay, some people are in stages of understanding their own stuff as well. So fair enough. But
it's interesting. It's interesting. It's that kind of intent, isn't it, really, I suppose?
Yeah, purposeful intent. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do you think that you find it easy to use CAD and so on because of the material you're working with, and because it's kind of heavy metal, isn't it? And I don't think are you kind of, as an artist, are you more material? Your artistic practice, is it kind of material led? If you had a more intuitive kind of way of working, it would be harder to transfer it onto those CAD, those more computer systems.
I think artists change, though. I think when I started out a very different artist to the one I am now. I think I started out painting, and there was kind of, that was my thing, and I was working, quite intuitively. So I don't know. I think you can kind of you can become whatever you want to be. So I think it's like you can learn how to do something and make it work for you. So I don't know. I don't think that. I'm not sure. I would I'm a bit of a Luddite really underneath it all. So, but I've just learned how to do stuff. So,
but the enduring interest, is it the material that leads you?
It's kind of it's everything really. It's everything. It's phase, scale. It's it's the whole thing. It's the color. It's like
Right.
Yeah.
And we've got a question in the chat from someone saying, why did you use the Oriental process?
Yeah.
Anna.
I was just
What was that?
you mentioned appropriation, so I was just curious as to what how that was.
Yeah. So I think because it's a specific process. So this idea of using, I was interested in how. I was interested in the history of the process, so that there was this kind of this
Oh,
building.
I see. Okay.
That they've used. Traditionally, it had been something that came from China and Japan, and then it was. There was a kind of appropriation. At a certain point, there was this appropriation, and like, right, we're gonna copy that way of doing something, and kind of make furniture using that process to meet the demands. And I think there's something. I just thought there's something interesting in that as a kind of idea.
Yeah, it is.
So that somehow it's echoing what's happening socially as well as sort of visually and through furniture.
And was the term called Japanesing? Did you say? Which I think's quite funny.
Yeah, so it's a kind of it's called Japanning. So,
That's so funny.
It's weird, isn't it? Yeah.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Just about the material-led work, or that they asked a little bit earlier. Do you find yourself? I mean, it's because you know how material behaves. Sometimes, I mean, you know the language of the material, and you make plan knowing how far you can push it.
Yeah.
Do you ever make plans or draw an idea for a specific piece, for a specific material, without knowing the outcome? Something that you have never pushed that far.
Yes. Yeah. So
And
I do.
that's the beauty, right? Is that the challenge, trying to push the material to a point that has never done before, has never been there before, and it might make it or not, but you try and push the property, push the.
So there's a bit of both. I think it's a kind of like I'm learning all the time, but also sometimes I kind of know, I sort of got a good idea of what's going to happen. So but there's room for things to change. There's room for things to develop. And also more recently, I've been working with colour in a different way. I haven't really published the pictures of the work, but I've been developing a new series of pieces where I'm kind of, they're made of stainless steel, but then the surface is sort of attacked with paint. So I don't really know what that is going to be. I don't know what it is yet. So it might be nothing, or it might be something. So yeah, it's a combination. And then I suppose, I guess with time you get a better understanding of how materials behave, and there is some satisfaction in that. That's kind of lovely thing, that when things work, and yeah.
Got a question.
Hey. Yeah.
Hiya.
Hi.
I hope you're right, everyone. I'm just interested in what are you interested in when things go wrong? What kind of what makes you interested in that, and what does that mean to you?
It's like, because nothing's perfect, and I like the idea of that. It's in between. It's like in between something being perfect and something not. So the surface is kind of perfect, but the form is like it's corrupted and it's gone wrong, and it's kind of I think there's all sorts of relationships you can draw on that. You can there's all sorts of references that has, and I guess it's partly about, like, the new pieces are all about that kind of looking at the mass-produced world, I suppose. These standard pieces of steel, and then somehow kind of people have got in the way, and we've kind of and it's sort of they become handmade, and they're gone wrong, So it's sort of that's what I'm interested in. Teresa.
Hi Julian.
Hi.
Brilliant as always. I still find it fascinating. I know we've had kind of discussion about craft, my partner being a cabinet maker.
Yeah.
And, that whole thing, I love showing process, and I like things going wrong and working with it. There's still part of me that's so stuck on the idea of, like, when I think of craftsmanship or being an artisan, it's often they're going for kind of looking for the perfect object and actually hiding the process.
Yeah. Well, I think I think I do. So a lot of the artists that I was talking about, sort of Philip de Barlo and Franz West, is they don't hide the process. It's very visible, and I'm sort of slightly kind of I wish I could do that in some way. I wish I could, because I do hide the process. There's a conceit there that it's not really doing that. It's not really bending. It's like I've made it look like that. So yeah, there's a sort of, I think actually I'm probably a bit more like, you know, the kind of cabinet maker hiding it away, wishing I could show people how it's done a little bit. So yeah.
So is that where the craft personship comes in more, though, in that sense of like trying to hide it because the craftsperson would normally try and hide the process, or
Yeah, maybe,
or
but
is it
that's.
just kind of like you're playing around with the whole idea and subverting it, or
I'm wondering if, because then you're still, then you're back on the sort of the stereotype of it, I suppose, because it's not just about
yeah.
how something, the surface of something. It's you know, there's a lot more to it than that. It can be. Yeah.
So
So
what stops you from showing the process then? Is it because you're so enamored by the finish and the colours and
yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's that buzz. It's that buzz of being in the, you know, when you're in the studio and you do something and you it feels right. I think that's,
yeah,
and it
yeah,
doesn't feel right when it's sometimes it does, but it's not always appropriate for the work.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
May I ask one more question?
And we've got
yeah,
a question. Rosie's been trying to ask a question for the entire time. So can we jump on, to Rosie first?
yeah, you're on,
And then,
Rosie.
and then we've got one from Kate as well. And then, yeah, sorry, jump on.
Hey Julian, I really enjoyed the talk. It's absolutely fascinating to
Thank
hear
you.
about. Yeah, I thought it was brilliant. Really,
Oh,
really fascinating. Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Teresa was saying, which I thought was an absolutely just a really interesting point and tension in like a lot of craft. You know, the tension between the sort of perfect and, you know, the artifice, and how much of the like non-neatness you choose to sort of put out there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just wanted to say I like that about your work, the fact that that seems to be a thing that you're looking at, and the kind of what that's it, the whole thing about kind of making a virtue of the process, which like you showed those other pieces that are kind of doing that in a sort of overt way, but I just think it's an interesting tension, and it was just nice to hear you talk about it. And yeah, Teresa, thanks for bringing up the cabinet maker thing. That was really interesting.
That's great. Yeah, no, I think that one, actually, that's a word that definitely, the word artifice, I think, is really interesting. This idea of something that's not, you know, is it what's real and what isn't? So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Who's next? Is it? I'll let you do it, Susie. Who's next?
Oh, we've got one in the chat. Is pink your favourite colour? Quite like the question.
Is pink my favourite colour? There's quite a lot of pink work in there. Yeah, I don't know. I was talking about this the other day with someone, but with a group. But I think what's it? Philip King said when he made a piece of work that was pink, and he said he wanted to make it the most it's the most unsculptural colour he could think of. So I don't think I've made much pink work, but I like other people's pink work. So I don't know. I think it's like, I guess with the Franz West, it becomes bodily, doesn't it? It's kind of that, you know, there's that they look quite intestinal, and so there's that instant kind of reference there. But,
Was there someone else wanting to ask a question?
Can I ask? Oh.
So yeah, go for it.
who's next?
Oh, me.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me properly.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about the word artisan and craftsman or craftswoman or person, because they're associated with the idea and concept of folk and maybe outside of art or to do with culture. So do you think the whole idea and concept of craftspeople and artisans have been, there seems to be a hierarchy where the artist has got quite a high rung, so to speak, and I think there's this, it's incongruous. It feels like it's incongruous. Do you think they maybe have a similar platform now?
Yeah. Yes, I know what you mean, and I think actually there's a questioning of that. With, you know, there's a lot of people, you know, that's like sort of, you know, like Ronald Begum doesn't want to be defined as as anything in particular.
No,
That kind
yeah, I
of
can imagine.
yeah, and you know, I think the word artisan is quite. What can I hear? I can hear something. Someone there. What's happening? Yeah, I think there are interesting phrases that you can use, and sorry, I'm getting distracted. I can hear like loads of noise coming. But I mean, like one of the one quote.
Turn into an alien.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? I'll just mute for a second, see what happens.
Can I suggest it's most probably someone who's got some background, maybe before you all mute ourselves?
Okay, that's good. That's good. That works. That works. So yeah, the terms artisan and yeah, I think someone once said to me that there was a you know the elevation of the artist is a kind of maybe a sort of Victorian thing, and that you know sort of Michelangelo would have maybe seen himself more as an artisan maybe in his time, and there's this kind of been this gradual elevation of the artist to being someone who deals with ideas and maybe less with the kind of nitty gritty. But I mean, there was actually quite an interesting. So Marx Karl Marx in his division of labour doesn't like the idea of the craftsman because it implies a sort of like something hereditary there, like it's a caste or a class system. Or speaks of that. So he always talked about the specialized worker. That's how he described it. So, you know, I think there's lots of different terminology, and I am interested in the terminology and what it means and how we use it, because there are so many kind of stereotypes associated with it. So yeah, it's a kind of, as I said at the start, it's a big question, and I don't really know. I haven't, you know, this is the kind of starting point in that really. Derry, did you have still? Did you?
Yeah, I've got a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
You hear me? Yeah, okay. The question was about that work. It's just a technical question. That work that you did called Crystal, which was the hand-blown glass that somebody effectively made. And I suppose what interests me about that is, unlike the steel one, where you can do it all on CAD, and then it's made by hand, literally millimeter by millimeter to your specification. When you're working with blown glass, you don't have that promise of accuracy. And I suppose I'm interested in and how you manage the I don't know, the gap or the expectation not being met or being partially met, where you've built, you know, you hand blown something that's already a risk because you know, I don't even know how you would get that millimeter perfect. And then I think you're saying you put it in a kiln and you've let it flop over an edge. You know, so you know, how did that work in terms of the it meeting your expectation? Because I'd be very surprised if it was exactly to the millimeter accurate to any of your models.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually, because I was quite open about it, I think, because I didn't know how to do it. So the idea, it was basically, it needs to be about that big. Can it be a sort of sausage shape, and then we'll bend it after that was made. Then we'll bend it there. And some of the pieces, we tried a number of different things. Originally, it was going to be a sort of stack of them, and they kept on rolling off and breaking, and or they kind of melted too much, and they kind of just sort of came apart, and you know, ended up on the bottom of scraping them off the bottom of the kiln. So it's that sort of openness. It's really enjoyable doing that. Let it happen.
Okay, thanks. And can I just ask a couple of clarifications on names?
Yeah.
Talked about Franz West, and afterwards you mentioned somebody. Was it Gust something?
Philip Guston.
Philip Guston.
Painter.
Philip Guston. We'll say painter. Yeah, that's right. And then there was another name I didn't quite get. Monica, somebody with the bent girder.
Oh, thanks. Sosnowska, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, Sosnowska. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Look, it's really good to hear your ways of working and all these intros to other people. So,
good. Well, thanks. It's lovely to see so many Art Academy guys here as well today. It's really nice of you.
We've got another question in the chat. So, feel differently about a piece if you haven't been physically involved in the process? like the polishing, etc.?
Definitely feel less tired. Yeah, and but feels quite good actually. It feels really yeah. No, I love it actually. I really enjoy it. It's a bit of a treat if it's done well. But I think like I'm working on a piece at the moment for Canary Wharf, and that's being made fabricators, and so that there is it's more stressful because you have less control over it. So the well, basically my sculpture lands on this guy's foot and he's broken his foot, so someone else has got to come in and make it. So we've sort of got to so it's that kind of thing is sort of happens, and you kind of got to try and it's a bit more stressful because you're explaining to people how to do how you want them to do something. So but if it works, it's a lovely thing. Treat.
That's a really interesting question. Do you get you said you love it and you're less tired, understandably, but do you get a wee bit more objectivity to it because you haven't exhausted yourself, you haven't been looking at that fine detail the whole time? Are you able to stand back more and observe the whole better? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it is definitely. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it is a much more objective thing. Yeah. Definitely, because that's half the challenge as an artist is I think like making work and then trying to be objective. It's quicker, comes faster. Yeah, when someone else is doing it.
We've got one more question in the chat, which I presume is possibly an Art Academy one.
Okay.
And can we have one in the workshop?
What's that?
How much is the robot? And can we have one in the workshop?
We've got because of all the the stone carving robot, I don't think so, but the 3D printers, but they're coming to the Art Academy. So
exciting. Yeah.
Can I ask a question, or is it too late?
No, fire on.
Thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. One I guess is a comment, and then the other one's kind of a loaded question. Right. The first comment I think is that this idea between like art and craftsmanship is that, I mean, to use Philip Guston as an example, like his previous paintings before the ones that everybody knows him for, which are like these huge blocks of color, like his previous paintings were actually very what you would call skilled, like painter stylistic paintings. And I think the difference is that you can teach somebody a skill, but you can't really teach them to express themselves artistically, and I think that is where the delineation lies, rather than this kind of like capitalist hierarchy and the Marxist idea of the skilled worker and things like that, for sure.
I think there's you're right. I think there's that idea of the technique, and you can there's a lot of time can be spent on that, but actually there's this other thing. It's a bit more tangible.
I don't know, maybe that turning yourself inside out aspect of art. And then I guess the question, which is also very self-centered question, in respect to sculpture now and in the future, and the quest for, or the lack of workshop space, and the lack of space in the larger cities that we get, and how we artists have to somehow continue making and doing these things with storage somewhere magically, and still be able to have a community of like-minded individuals, or not have to essentially fuck off to the country that's a 2-hour drive out of a city and then come in, once a month or something, or for some big events. And it seems that that's almost changed the aspect or the look of fine art in general nowadays. And maybe if you could just speak to that, I think is kind of what I'm getting at.
Well, I'm kind of speaking as someone who's fucked off to the country, so I kind of
it's right, exactly.
It is a thing. I suppose the Brian Griffiths piece, the cardboard work, I think that was came at a time when the sort of tuition fees were coming in, grants were disappearing, and I think he had like a big appeal to a lot of students at the time. He wanted to, you could work. It was like giving permission to work using quite basic, humble materials, but it's what you did with them. So there is that. But then I think also actually, in terms of I think things are a bit more organised. So I think I was chatting to Susie earlier about the Black Horse Workshop and these places where they people are offering facilities for sculptors to work or for artists to work, and make their practice. It is a different, it's a different landscape, and London is really tricky to try and navigate and try to sort of, make it work. But I think the answer is probably some of these communal workshops that, like the London Sculpture Workshop or wherever, to enable people to do that, because it just gets more and more expensive. I don't know if there's not really. I haven't got. I wish I had an answer. Yeah.
Are you happy being out in the country though? I mean, I feel like just having a garage out there and a workshop out there would be almost worth. Being out of the city, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I recommend it. You should do it. Yeah, it's good. And I have to be honest. It makes like the whole lockdown thing is totally different out of London.
Yeah.
Totally different.
For sure.
Any final questions from anyone else? Okay.
Oh, I was going to say, could I ask one? Is it too late?
No. If that's well with you, Julian. You got
Thank you very much, Julian. It was a great talk as well. Yes, it is. Sorry, can you hear? I don't know if you can see or not. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the talk. It was amazing. When we're going back to, say, the craftsmanship that you were talking about, with the sort of seems like a bit of a craftspersonship of whether that changes or whether you can have a sort of to and fro between a lot of elements that seem to be coming up, because you were talking about the demoralisation, but then also being sensual as well, and it seemed to be like a mixture of both, as well as the craftsmanship, and then also the ease of making things as mass productively as well. So, and then the whole process of making it as opposed to having a finished product as well. So does that element of the craftspersonship change along the way, or do you feel like that's just a balance that you have with your work? It's sort of like a element of both.
It does change. I think it is. Yeah, it's changing all the time. So I think there's a kind of, and I just see all these different processes as tools. Really, they're like so it's just sort of whatever you can lay your hands on to produce what you want to make. And I suppose from my perspective, actually, I think it's kind of it's by hand, it's by machine, it's by robot, it's everything. I think it's like the idea of notions of craftspersonship are everywhere. They're part of the whole practice. So
perfect. So it shouldn't be channeled into one element. You can still have that craftspersonship as quite an open-ended.
Yeah, and I don't think it. Yeah, and I think it's not about, for me, it's not about how it's about the intent, and it's about the kind of deliberateness of making and the control of the process. So if someone's you can be making something out of, I don't know, tissue paper, and it doesn't last, it's ephemeral and it disappears, but it still can be a crafted object because of how you've controlled that material.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. All right.
Very much, Julian. We do this every time. If everyone could just unmute their microphones, I would just give Julian a big round of applause.
Yay! Thank you.
Bravo.